John Hopkins Medicine of 2019 reports that an estimated 19 million people suffer with the phobia, ranging from moderate to severe. Phobias are actually classified as a type of anxiety disorder. So just imagine someone living with so much fear and anxiety because they can't fathom to face their phobia. Well, Dr. Rosenberg, a more psychological group on February 4 of 2015, actually talks about how so many people live their life avoiding their phobia because they can't fathom to face it, thinking they're in control. But really it's the opposite. Their phobia is the one controlling them. Now I'm going to be talking about how people can treat their phobia. Phobias cause people to live life feeling helpless that they'll ever not have a phobia, but by overcoming it, they'll be able to live that life without a fear. Exposure therapy is by far the most beneficial method to cure phobia. I'm going to be talking about what exposure therapy is, what different types of exposure therapies there are, and why it's beneficial. So to know why it's beneficial, we need to know exactly what it is. Exposure therapy is exactly what it sounds like. American Psychological Association, or APA for short, on July of 2017, actually defines it as a type of psychological treatment. It's basically when a patient is in a room that's a safe and comforting environment exposed to their phobia. So, exposure therapy actually dates back to the 1900s because of a Russian scientist named Ivan Pavlov, who basically not only experimented with how people develop a phobia, but also how to reverse that. He basically created exposure therapy. On Psychology Today by Noam Spencer on December 18th of 2020, he lists several experiments. One of them done by John B. Watson, known as Little Albert, which caused exposure therapy to become popular in the US. It was basically a little kid who was conditioned to fear an object because a bad sound was associated with it. But John B. Watson also experimented with reversing those effects, essentially applying what Ivan Pavlov did to his own experiments. I just spoke about what exposure therapy is, where it started, and how it became popular in the US. So now I'm going to be talking about all the different types. So since when do we have different types, you might wonder? Not only will I be talking about the different types, I will be talking about what phobias fall under those different types and how sessions would be paced. So the first one is known as vivo exposure, which basically means you're directly facing your phobia. The second one is known as imaginal exposure, which means you're imagining your phobia in details. The third one is virtual reality exposure, which means that you're facing your phobia through a virtual reality. The fourth one is known as interoceptive exposure, which means you're trying to trigger the feeling that you have a phobia of. So American Psychological Association of July 2017 actually says vivo exposure is commonly used if you can feel your phobias, such as fear of snakes or fear of spiders. Imaginal exposure is most commonly used like if you have, let's say, a fear of holes, trypophobia. Virtual reality exposure is most commonly used if it can't be done inside of a room, like phobia of flights or trains. The last one, interoceptive exposure, is commonly used if you have a fear of like choking. You might be asked to stimulate that feeling with maybe a turtleneck. Professionals will pace your sessions depending on how many phobias you have and how bad they are. So for example, graded exposure starts with the least severe and it goes to the most severe phobia. The next one's flooding. It's the exact opposite. You start with the worst, then you escalate to the least. Then there's systematic desensitization, which means that while you're facing your phobia, you're going through calming and de-stressing exercises to calm yourself down and think rationally. So I just spoke about the different types of exposure therapies, what phobias fall under those categories, and how the sessions would be paced. So now that we know the different types, let's talk about why exposure therapy is the most beneficial method. So exposure therapy would actually allow someone to lead a life phobia-free. So I'm going to be talking about all the benefits as well as how effective exposure therapy is. So there are a lot of benefits, but the main one, which is the reason why so many people actually do it, is known as habituation, which means that as you progress with your sessions, you're not going to be thinking about your phobia, and whenever you face your phobia, you have little to no symptoms. The second one is actually confrontational skills. So as people progress with their sessions, they'll be able to build up those skills. Because people who have phobias tend to avoid their fear and phobia, they might lack those skills because of how much they avoid it. So over time, as they go through their sessions, they'll not only be building up those skills, but they can also apply that to their everyday life. The last one is emotional tolerance and stability. So because people who have phobias are facing so much stress and anxiety because they're being exposed to their phobia, they build up a tolerance and stability to stress-induced situations because of how many times they go to exposure therapy. So because people do exposure therapy repeatedly and go to so many sessions, they will actually see results, and the results are very effective. Timothy Legg of Medical News Today on May 5 of 2020 actually reports that around 60% to 90% of people see results, as in little to no symptoms, whenever they come in contact with their phobia. So we just discussed the benefits and effectiveness of exposure therapy. So as much as we don't want to face our phobias because we're afraid, why let it conquer your everyday life when you can fix it through such a successful method? So with all that's been said, exposure therapy is by far the most beneficial method to cure phobia. So I just discussed what exposure therapy is, the different types of exposure therapies, as well as why it's so beneficial. So we may assume that out of sight and out of mind applies to phobia, but it really doesn't, because your